Namaste, everyone. Welcome back to Ripples in the Sand, a podcast brought to you by the folks at Drifting Sands Haibun. Here, we invite Haibun poets who have appeared in the journal to both read and discuss their poetry. I am your host, Sangita and I am a novice in the Haikai path and am still learning the art of Haibun. Haibun, as many of you may know, is a form in which prose is interleaved with haiku. In this series of readings, I hope that along with hearing excellent Haibun, we also learn a bit more about the form and the creation of the piece. So I am so excited to be talking with our guest for today. Let me tell you a little bit. Based in Tipperary, Ireland, he's the founder and editor of the Haibun Journal and editor of the Irish print journal Haiku Spirit, 1998 to 2000. His first solo collection, Let Silence Speak, was shortlisted for the Touchstone Distinguished Books Award in 2016. And his 2021 book, Fragmentation, has been awarded the Best Haibun Collection by the Haiku Society of America Merit Books Award in 2022. In 2021 and 2022, he was awarded literature bursaries by the Art Council of Ireland. Warm welcome, Master Haibunier, Sean O'Connor.
It's lovely to be here. It's great to be talking to you, Sangita. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for coming. So how is it over there? Here in Minnesota, we've already had almost a week of snow. The world is all white, and it's going to remain white for another few months now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, we don't get so much snow here in Ireland. So we're a very temperate climate. So it's just overcast, raining slightly. We call it soft rain. Soft. It's a very pleasant atmosphere, and it's unusually warm for November, as it's about 12 degrees Celsius. That's quite warm for this time of the year. But having said that, next week we could be covered in snow.
That would be a change, wouldn't it?
Yeah, nothing surprises us in Ireland. The weather is very difficult to predict, but it's very temperate and very mild climate all year round. And having spent 5 years in Japan, where winter is really, really cold, Siberian, and the summer is tropical with high humidity and high temperatures, Ireland is in a remarkably sort of level, temperate climate. It never gets very hot. It never gets that cold. So we're blessed here, which is why we make such good dairy products, apparently.
Yeah.
The grass is good.
Potatoes as well. Good potatoes.
Yeah, good, lots of good.
Okay, so no sitting and writing by a warm fire yet for you.
Oh no, the fire is on. No, the fire is on.
Yeah,
the fire is on, yeah. But it's not very warm, but it's not cold either. It's just nice.
So I will tell the readers, if you have a fire, if it's cold, start your fire, get a cup of tea, and we will have your reading session soon. So for the readers, I'm going to request that Sean introduce the Haibun before reading, and I would like to wait until the end of all your readings before picking your brains about Haibun.
That's great.
Yeah. So you will be reading from your fascinating book, Fragmentation, about your father, about memory, about loss, snapshots of recent history. Yeah, also, all this COVID interleaving into all this memory and dementia. So, my mother and great-grandmother were afflicted with a loss of memory. And so this book really touched the chord so deep in me. So thank you for the experience. Looking at the list of poems that you've chosen, I know we're in for a good treat. So without further ado, let's get started. I can't wait.
Thank you so much, Sangita. So I'm reading a few Haibun from Fragmentation, and it is concerned, as you say, with the experience of working alongside a loved one who is living with dementia, which in this case is my father. For the last 4 years of his life, he lived in a dementia-specific unit in a nursing home. And what I found was that everybody knows that people experiencing dementia at different levels occasionally go back into the past and they relive the past as if it's right now in a very vivid way. So there were times when my father thought I was his father, and he'd be talking to me and I was kind of puzzled by what he's saying, and then the penny would drop that he actually thinks I'm his father. And there was all that kind of moments of confusion, but also moments of great lucidity and joy and fun and so on. Not all bad, but in that process, both of us then started to learn more about each other and our pasts, because I would sit there and I never really understood what he thought of his father until he thought I was his father. And then I could see the relationship he had with his father, for example. But it also brings up memories in the person who's the carer. They dig deep into their past. And it's like reliving. And the expression I use in the book Fragmentation is, it's like being in the editing suite of a movie, but the movie is our life. And what's happening is there's a new editor re-editing it. So you know the way when you're watching a movie, we're used to seeing flashbacks, as they call flashbacks. And really what was happening over those 4 years is we were like reliving the movie of our lives, or rewatching it with flashbacks. So some of the pieces may not be directly to do with dementia or my father, but they're to do with those flashbacks that happen for both of us all the time. So I'll open with a piece which is the opening of the entire book, which sets the scene, and it's called Windows. And this was published actually in Drifting Sands #2, when it was just a little baby journal starting off its 2nd issue. So I'll start with Windows. Windows. As I arrive on the scene, I immediately realize my father is having a stroke. He is seated in his local pub where he had gone for help when he felt something was wrong. His left arm is limp. A paramedic asks me to confirm that the left side of his face is drooped. He looks startled and helpless, and there is an atmosphere of unstated fear and concern among the bar's patrons, among his friends. Speeding ambulance, through its tinted windows, a waning moon. The following day, I go to my father's house to gather some of his clothes to bring to the hospital. There is a photograph on his bedroom wall of a boy on a cart pulled by a donkey. There are 2 large milk churns on the vehicle. The boy, who is 3 years old, holds the reins in his hands. He is in charge. That boy is me. On the bedside locker, there is a travel guide for Japan, the one he used when he visited us there. That night with my dad, his joyful discovery, the dance of fireflies. The stroke unit is always busy. As the days go by, I recognize more and more staff, cleaners, caterers, physios, and nurses. I begin to know what shift is on. The patients too become familiar, many in wheelchairs, others with sticks or frames. One man seems always to sit in his wheelchair beside a small window. For weeks I greet him, the man who never speaks. He finally nods. 3 weeks on, there is a confused message on my phone from a paramedic in the back of an ambulance. It seems they are transferring my father to a rehabilitation centre in the next county. I arrived there late at night to find him bewildered and exhausted. He seems relieved to see me. A nurse suggests that I bring him something personal to put in his room to reassure him. His house is covered with posters of famous motorbikers. There are racing memorabilia everywhere. He was a sidecar racing champion. I choose something I think might help and bring it to the rehab unit. It is much calmer there than in the hospital, and he is more settled. For the time being, perched on the rehab window, my father's trophy. He sits on an elaborate bed which quietly hisses and puffs as it automatically adjusts to his weight. Several staff come and go during my visit. Each time he introduces them to me, saying, "This is my father." At the door of his room, I turn and wave to him. Daffodils outside. On his hospital bed, my dad is crying. The second piece I'll read is from his time in a specialist unit with physiotherapy and so on. And it's called Come and See. Come and see. My father is usually at the window when I arrive. The view from there is sparse. The blank wall of a dementia unit is only meters away. Between wall and window is a strip of tightly clipped lawn, 2 fragile young trees, and some flowers. They bloomed late this year, these bright daffodils, already turning. Above the wall is enough sight of sky to judge the weather, and so he feels confident to give me his forecast. It will or won't rain, or it's lovely out now, better get out in it as it won't last. It's only a pet day. During visits, he repeatedly shuffles around the bed to look outside. It took me a while to decipher his comments when at the window. "I thought there was one, but there are 2, he said. "Always busy, always working away, especially in the morning." When a workman passed by this afternoon, I asked my father if he was one of the workers he was talking about. No, he said. "He's the gardener. He's a good worker too, mind you. He's always about the place, lots to do. The other 2 come and go. Have to keep an eye out to catch them. They're usually here in the morning. One of them got a snail and was banging it off a stone for ages till it broke." As I was about to leave, my father was back at the window when his face lit up. "There they are," he said. "Come and see." Among fresh daisies, a blackbird and a thrush, my father's new friends. So if I switch back into some of my own memories in the book, I'll move forward to a piece called Migration, which is from my school days, my last day of school, actually. Migration. On his way to the first exam of the Leaving Cert, Paul Kinsella is hit by a car and killed. The school vice principal and nun tells us of his death just minutes before the exam starts. "He could be an imp sometimes, but we all loved him," she says. I still feel a twinge of resentment at that word, imp. He was my friend. The exams are in the school gym, and its high, hard walls amplify our sobbing. As the exam ends, Deirdre Bradshaw burst into an uncontrolled wailing. Between our exams, in our school uniforms, we bury our classmate. There's a large green beside the school. Every autumn it fills with a noisiness and bustle that sounds like a schoolyard full of children, but the school is long closed. 40 years on, when I hear this commotion, I remember Paul and my old classmates, living and dead. Brent Geese. This year I wonder, have they all returned? From a very different part of my life when I was training to be a psychiatric nurse and working in the A&E. This is called Day One. Day 1. On my first morning as a student nurse in A&E, I am assigned to resus, the deep end. Within minutes, the emergency phone rings, its light flashing. Gown up, resus 1. Standing around the room are 6 nurses, 2 doctors, and myself. We are briefed. Male, late 30s, unconscious, query overdose, ETA 6 minutes. Time drags on as we wait in silence. No place for small talk. Then a siren. Doors crash open nearby. A commotion in the corridor and in they come. The ambulance crew with the patient, who is limp and lifeless. Instructions fly about. Syringes drawn up. Different types, different doses. Clothes cut away. Intubation on standby. Defib ready. After a few minutes, everything slows down. The lead doctor pauses to think. Any family with him? He asks the crew. They hesitate. Yes, but get them in here. There is only chance. Be quick, please. A family member comes in and immediately tells the doctor what he needs to know, without being asked. As the team spring back into action, I look down at the patient's relative. He is so calm. Drug overdose. To help us find a vein, his little boy. The next piece I'm going to read is called Unlit. Unlit. This morning, as my doctor explains my prostate problems to me, I can hear the sounds of children playing in a nearby schoolyard. I am aging. All afternoon I walk ridges and laneways through Fantan, Borrisalee, and out past the Rag. From here the gaping devil's bit is today filled with black cloud. In a fit of anger, the devil took a bite out of the mountain, only to spit it out in disgust, and so created the Rock of Cashel. My grandfather walked these fields barefoot to a one-room school still standing beyond that low ridge. Every child had to bring a sod of turf with them for the fire. A fire long unlit. I will never be a grandfather or a father. In all this walking, I have not seen a single person. Late autumn light lies light on the land, an empty land, gone cold with the slow fall of night. Field of stubble, that distant bull, his plume of breath. So I'll finish this with the last piece. I began with Windows, which opens the book, fragmentation, and I'll finish with part of the last Haibun, which is called Baby. It is freezing on this side of the COVID hub, so I keep my coat and gloves on. A staff member wheels my father in, both of them in Santa hats. He takes his off when he sees me and looks at it in his lap for a while before saying anything. We spend the first 10 minutes of our half-hour slot establishing that it's Christmas Eve, then the weather, and that he's well looked after. Dinner handed up to you, and the best the grub it is. Just as we're out of time, he reaches into the crib and pats the head of one of the Meiji. Then he presses his finger on the belly of baby Jesus. He turns to me and says, "I'll never forget it. You were a tiny baby. They said you were going to die. They all said you would die, but you didn't. You didn't." I am sanitizing my hands as he's wheeled away, and I hear him say, "That's a son of mine, you know. A son of mine." This fragile life, snow-loaded clouds, slippy underfoot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was an experience in itself. Oh, I'm so speechless.
You're not allowed to be speechless in a podcast. Do you know that?
Yep. Yep. However, oh my goodness, yeah, all this, you've taken us through a journey of memories, memory lane, down a memory lane. Quick question. In Come and See, the dialogues of your father, it was almost like a ziyuhitsu in itself, you know. So the realization that he was talking about birds. Oh my God, that was such a sweet and slightly startling picture, right? Especially when he says he got a snail and was banging it off a stone for ages. And just before that, you were talking about a worker, thinking, goodness, what's this worker doing banging a snail on a stone for ages? And then the haiku rounds it up. So lovely. Can you tell us a little bit more about this style of writing? I mean, the style of almost like a ziyuhitsu in Haibun. This is not a ziyuhitsu, but still.
No, it's not this isn't a ziyuhitsu, but there's a lot of confusion about ziyuhitsu, so it would be,
Yeah.
I would need a lot of time to explain it. But the ziyuhitsu is one of the oldest forms of writing. It originated in Japan. It's older than the novel by hundreds of years.
Yeah.
It literally translates, ziyuhitsu translates as following the brush. And a lot of Westerners have the impression that you just write down whatever comes to mind, and then it's a ziyuhitsu. But that would be a very difficult, unlikely to succeed, because whatever comes to our mind is of no particular consequence to anybody else. And we write for readers, not for ourselves, ultimately, if we're going to have impact with readers. So the ziyuhitsu form was so well established by the time of Basho and his companions who developed the Haibun form 400 years ago, that it's natural that they would have elements of ziyuhitsu in it. So what are the elements that we might see in this one? And in ziyuhitsu generally, one is that the ziyuhitsu are not linear at all, and they can go off in unexpected directions, and they do go off. In fact, to make it even more problematic for writers, one of the aspects of ziyuhitsu is that there is no theme in the writing at all, no theme at all. So modern Japanese writers, such as professional novelists, once a year, one of the big publishing houses in Japan asks about 5 or 6 of them who've no history of writing ziyuhitsu to try a ziyuhitsu. And they published this in one of the big newspapers in Japan, but they also published the comments of those writers about what it was like trying to write one. And so far, all of them have said that they find it next to impossible, that it's an extremely complex art form, and none of them felt that they'd succeeded so far. However, when you walk into a Japanese bookshop, there will be a whole section called ziyuhitsu, including all the Haibun books, because Haibun is in the minds of people connected to ziyuhitsu. So there is an expectation of a non-linear pattern to Haibun, generally speaking, and an ability to shift themes within themes. However, this is very, very tricky work. This is not simple. And one thing that I'd like to clarify is, just because a lot of writers write in a non-linear way, but writing non-linear does not qualify it to be a ziyuhitsu. It's not the only aspect. But in this case, it was illuminating from the point of view of dementia, because here's my father and he's in a dementia unit and he's saying something that actually, once you know what he's talking about, makes perfect sense. But because I couldn't understand the context that he was talking about 2 birds, I naturally misunderstood him. And it highlights this thing that just because someone is experiencing dementia doesn't mean that we're not the one that's confused.
Right.
So I put the reader into the position I was in, where I was baffled by what he was saying. But once I realized what was happening, and he says, come and see, and I see what's happening, then it was one of those slightly humorous situation where I'm the one that's confused, not him. So I liked that about it. But I do pay a lot of attention to ziyuhitsu and read them a lot from Japan. I have to read the Japanese ones. And it does influence my writing, all right. And but it's very, very, very difficult to get those techniques down. It's the
Right.
extreme. It takes decades to get that.
Right.
Not something for the faint-hearted. Very hard to achieve it. I think it's very problematic.
Yeah.
I wouldn't rush to write them.
Yeah, this taking the concept of link and shift to a completely different level, isn't it?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because link and shift is a Western import. There's no evidence that Japanese ever used link and shift at all.
Really? Oh.
Not in Haibun. Link and shift is a technique used specifically in Renga, but there's a twist. The verses of the Renga, and it is ultimately a collective poem, so it's a single unit. So the Renga master will say, appoint the next poet to write either a two-line verse or a three-line verse, and it had to be linked. The poem had to develop, so it couldn't be wild. You couldn't go off on a big tangent. So they were looking for a connection, a progression of the poem. That's what they mean by link. What they meant by shift was, and this I think will surprise a lot of listeners who write Haibun. What the shift meant was that the Renga master would give a preordained subject that had to be alluded to or directly mentioned.
I see.
Which meant that the shift was preordained. So, for example, a shift might be, in the next verse, you've got to write 2 lines of 7 syllables. It has to connect with what's come before. But in this one, you have to mention an animal, any animal at all.
Yeah.
Or in this one, you have to mention autumn. Or in this one, you have to mention a bicycle. Just made up a bicycle there. But it would be typically things like that. So it was a challenge to the poet to not only continue the poem, but shift in a new direction, which is preordained.
Yeah.
And those shifts were preordained before they sit down to write.
Yeah.
So everyone knows in advance that verse number 16 is going to have to mention, for example, an animal.
Okay.
And that's what link and shift means. But there is no tradition of doing that in Haibun, and I have no idea why so many essays have been written saying about it. I have no idea who thought of that, but it wasn't. I've never seen it in Japanese literature. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. The whole point of a Haibun is that the prose is subservient to the haiku, and that the haiku are written first.
Okay.
Now, that's a complete misunderstanding of the way a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people in the West are talking a lot about link and shift. And I never understood it, because I think, is this a license to just write whatever comes into your head for the haiku and then claim it's a shift?
Yeah.
Because sometimes the shift is so dramatic that I'm going, this has nothing to do with what's come before.
Right.
And it's lost its bearings. Whereas the prose supports the haiku, not the other way around. And the evolution of this was the haiku. I think it's important to realize haiku and haibun developed at the exact same time with the same writers.
Okay.
So what happened was this guy, Matsuo Basho, was a renowned haiku writer, which is the first verse. It literally means opening verse of a renga. And that had a role to generate the emotional atmosphere and the general atmosphere of the actual meeting. And the way they did that was they used the natural environment. So to give an example, if the poets were sitting there and they meet every month and it's winter and snow has started outside, but one of the poets has died since they last met, the atmosphere will be a bit forlorn and subdued. So people like Basho in the opening line might refer to freezing snow, right? So they'll use a kigo to inject the emotional response. However, let's say another meeting and the snow is outside, same situation, but instead of somebody dying, one of the poets has just had a baby a couple of weeks ago. And there's a sort of an uplifted atmosphere. The birth went well, the baby's fine and mother's fine, and they're a little bit upbeat. Well, then they would look at the snow, and this time they would say fresh snow, or new snow. And you can see how the kigo then developed. So this kigo writing was really critical to the opening verse and had a separate role. And writers who could write that became renowned for their ability to be so skilled that they could capture the mood and atmosphere of the occasion in so few words, in just 3 lines.
Right.
So Basho was a renowned haiku writer, and he decided to separate it out. I'm going somewhere with this. He decided to separate it out into what's now called haiku, and still called haiku sometimes. Haiku, by the way, a little stop. And when they were doing that, as they were doing it, sometimes they put a notes or a paragraph before it or a paragraph after it, more commonly afterward, to contextualize the haiku. And those paragraphs grew. And then sometimes they'd add another haiku to it. And then the famous one is Basho's Road to the Deep North, where he spent 3 months walking on a journey. And as he was writing haiku and making notes as he went along. And afterwards, he put it all together into what was one of the first long Haibun. And sometimes with sequences of haiku. But it was always the haiku were the dominant aspect of the Haibun. And Haibun means skillful sentences. So all it was the haiku means a skillful verse. Ku is a verse.
Yeah.
So if it's not a verse, it's not a haiku, full stop. By definition, it says on the tin, must be a verse. So a verse is what we're expecting. And these are the fundamentals. Haiku is a skilled verse, and a haibun is a haiku with skillful sentences, not any old sentences. And therefore, there was never any talk of linking and shifting. The relationship between haiku and the prose was never a link and shift one.
I see.
Just Westerners came along and somebody said, oh, that looks like it goes there. And I don't know what happened after that. But the fact that people write in link and shift, I mean, it doesn't bother me. I mean, people can do what they like. But the form itself doesn't depend on that. And I think it's a woolly idea. Shifting where? In what way? If you look at link and shift in the Renga, it was a specific shift.
Yes.
Very black and white.
If
they said mention an animal in the next verse, you either mentioned one or you didn't.
Yeah.
And if they said allude to autumn in the next verse, you either did that or you didn't. So it was quite clear cut what they meant by shifting. Whereas we've left that as a very open-ended thing. And a lot of writers like open-ended because they don't like any restrictions in their writing. But in my experience, writing, all art is about form, and form is critical, is a defining aspect of art. And it's very difficult to succeed if we abandon forms or we make them too loose. It's difficult to succeed. That was a long answer. Sorry about that.
Actually, I've heard you say this before, so I know which team you're on. You're on team form.
Well, I don't think there's a team at all. People either write and people either respect forms or they don't. And if they don't, they enter into a world called the new and untested. So we will have to wait a few decades to see if any of these pass the test. And if they do, then it will be a new form, and then people who work to form will work to those forms. In the meantime, there's no team and there's no division. It's just there are writers who write particularly careful and pay particular care about form, respect form and technique and all of that stuff. And there are writers who don't. And the writers who don't generally, and I hate to say it, they're into the realm of new and untested, and they rarely pass the test. In the long term, that work fades into the background. It doesn't make impact. I'm sorry to say that, but that's the reality. And if people want to do that, I have no problem with it. There's no team, there's no competition. There's nothing to say about this. You either don't listen to me, listen to the whole world of artists who constantly say, listen to every musician who talks about form and the importance, listen to every artist who'll talk about it, and then make your own mind up. And in every art form, there are people who try to go outside forms, but they tend to flounder. It tends to flounder. And I prefer tried and tested to try to make it up as I go along. And I certainly don't like to reinvent the wheel. I try to figure out how to make the wheel. Making a wheel is a difficult thing.
Yeah. Very
I
true.
think
Very
I
true.
think things are difficult enough without venturing into abandonment of form and technique and all of that stuff and getting loose and fast with it. But I don't mind if people, I don't care what people do, to be honest with you. What other people do is their business. So there's no, I don't see it as a team, or I don't see it as a division. There is no dichotomy. I think in America there's a dichotomy over absolutely everything these days. It's become a binary society.
Wow.
Yeah, you're either Republican or Democrat. You're either gay or you're straight, or you're black or you're white. Everything is sort of binary. And
Well, it's
as a
not just in America, it's in a lot of parts of the world, I would
it is, but
say.
I'm sitting in Ireland, and when you're looking from the outside, it's certainly a lot more binary than a lot of other places. You know, there are big differences. I know when you're sitting in America, you think you're in the center of the world, but I have bad news for you. The center of the world is everywhere in the world. Everywhere is the center of the world. You know, everywhere you sit is the center point for the whole world. So
This is true. This is true.
yeah, but it's not something I hear discussed in haiku circles in most parts of the world.
Mm.
It's not something I hear. It's not a dominant idea. And in mainstream writing, that discussion isn't even happening. So there's no teams out there. If there are teams, they're in a very small pocket of the world. And there is nothing. I mean, I'd never hear it. I'm interacting with mainstream groups constantly. I never hear this. For example, the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2019 went to a very long established British poet called Roger Robinson. And his main poem in the book that won the T.S. Eliot Prize is called Haibun for the Lookers, and it's a haibun. And yet I've never met any haibun writer in the scene that actually even knows that he won the T.S. Eliot Prize for this. So far, I haven't met people that know it. Seems like I'm the only one that knows it. But the point is, in the mainstream, he's a very famous poet, and he's made Haibun very famous. And he's not going around asking questions about form or wondering about these things, and his colleagues aren't. So it depends on who you ask or where you're talking or who you're talking to. But when I'm talking to people in different countries about Haibun and haiku, I don't hear these discussions going on that I hear emanating from a relatively small area of the world in the English language.
Yeah, English.
And we can forget that there's this language called Spanish, which is one of the biggest languages in the world, with thousands of Haibun writers and haiku writers. I mean, the whole of Latin America and Spain. We forget that there's Portuguese writers writing Haibun, the very good ones. Portuguese, a very widely spoken language in parts of Africa, not just Brazil and Portugal. We forget about the big languages, the other big languages of the world. And even in the Romanian language, which is a relatively small language with only a country of only 19 million people, a country I've visited a lot and worked in a lot, they've been writing haiku and haibun for decades in Romanian. And they're very active, and I've been active with them since the 90s. I hear different discussions in different places, is what I'm trying to say. And I certainly don't hear it in Japan, where I spent 5 years of my life working with Japanese haiku and haibun writers, and never once did this come up. So I don't know where the teams are, but if there is teams, they're playing on a pitch somewhere. I'm not sure where it is. I don't know about that game.
It's a different game. So I had a question, not a question, but just a little bit, let's talk about day one. So yeah, actually, after I read this one, I was in bed and reading, and I sat speechless for a while. And, my mind was going between the boy who was so calm, and the focus was the boy who was so calm, and then there's this commotion going all around in the hospital. I wanted to cry. So in this poem, you use a haiku in a very different way, and it works beautifully. The haiku is very close to the prose, and despite all the Haibun pundits have been telling me lately, but I think that this is the only way this particular piece could have been written. Now, this is all what I'm thinking. All this despite now you please clarify, not knowing why a family member was called. How could the boy help? I mean, I really couldn't understand that part, but that has nothing to do with me feeling what your Haibun wanted me to feel. So that was a secondary thought in my head. So what do you?
Okay, I'll try and unravel some of that. So you were saying, how could the boy help?
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the haiku is drug overdose.
Yeah.
To help us find a vein, his little boy. So what's happening there is the doctors need to find a vein that hasn't collapsed so that they can give the antidote to the heroin.
Okay. So do you need a family member for that, or how does that work?
The boy knows where the father has been shooting up because he will have seen.
Okay, got it now.
Yeah, because it's a drug overdose.
I got it now.
The child will see the parent shooting up casually in their house. So we used to regularly ask anybody who knew the person and who might have seen where they're shooting up to ask, where are they shooting up?
Where did they? Okay.
Yeah. So the common answer is between the toes. There's usually the veins collapse in the arms first, and then they go for other parts of their body. And when they get really advanced into this, it usually ends up between the toes that they can find a vein. So we can't, those veins are no use to us. The ones that are collapsed, they can't inject into them, and we can't either. So we urgently need to inject drugs like naloxone and so on to save their life, and it really works. It works really quickly too, shockingly quickly. But the boy would have seen all this before, would have been in the resource before.
I got it.
And is quite calm about this, and just kind of points to where the veins are that can be used. And they know, the boy knows that once he, in this case, it could be a girl, you know, but once they say this is where the veins are that they're using, they know that within the next 20 seconds their parent is going to be saved. Yeah. So they're all very cool about it.
Oh my God. To be in a situation like that, yeah.
And was there some other question you had about the fact that haiku is close to the prose?
Yeah.
Well, this is what I was saying earlier, that the haiku comes before the prose. I have never written a Haibun without writing haiku first. I need to know why I'm writing this prose.
Yeah.
So I start with haiku, always did. And that was how the form develops. That was the original method of the form. The haiku first, the prose then work around the haiku. Now, we don't always use every haiku that we might write in advance, or we might rewrite them as we go, but the process is haiku first. I hear a lot of writers say that I find it hard to write the haiku after the prose, and I'm there going, well, of course you do. You've got the wrong way around. But I don't know how someone could, I don't know how you can do that so easily, but some people are very happy to do that, and if it works, it works, you know. So I wouldn't criticize it, but I just never did it myself, and I don't know if I can. I don't know if I'm able to do that. I don't know if I could write a piece of prose and then attach haiku to it.
Yeah. I get
so in that sense, there should be a close relationship. You'd expect there to be, hence the term link in a renga means there's a close relationship even there without shifting. So the haiku is in my head, the haiku are at the center of the Haibun. They are largely the point of what you're writing. So in that sense, it is obvious to me that the haiku will be very close and even continue. It even reveals the story in some ways. If it's at the end, but they're not always at the end. They could be first, and there could be 10 haiku. And I suppose one last other thing is, I've seen people say this thing about you shouldn't use a word in the haiku that's in the text. Or I say the haiku, but there could be 10 haiku. But generally speaking, and I don't know where that came from either.
Oh, is it? Okay.
I have no idea where that's another Western import. I just don't know where that idea came from. And it seems to be a reasonable idea, but I don't quite buy it, because sometimes you must say what's already gone.
Yeah.
That you've no option but to say what's going on. And you see, it's the cart before the horse, because it's not that the haiku is repeating something that's in the prose. The prose is repeating something that's coming in the haiku.
Right.
That's what's going on.
Right.
Because the haiku,
I got it.
in the natural order of things, you write your haiku first. So you can't say the haiku is repeating what's in the prose, because the haiku is written first. It's the prose that's repeating it.
Yeah. So it's almost like you have decided what to write about in your haiku, and then you write it in the prose.
Okay,
yeah.
That's a great question. So how to go about writing a Haibun? The first step is to contemplate the subject you're going to write about. To contemplate, not think about it. Contemplate is half meditative.
Yeah.
And keep doing that in some cases for days, weeks, or even months, mulling it over in your head until eventually haiku emerge from that. And you start to make notes for haiku. Yeah. And then when I've got a number of haiku down that I think could work in what I'm contemplating writing about, only then do I start to write prose and work on the prose. And then the haiku are already available. So I'm already orientated towards those haiku. May not use them all the haiku, but I'll definitely use at least one. Yeah. And then the prose is then integrated straight away, and the story will evolve itself as happens with writing. You can't anticipate what way it's going to go. So I might need to write a new haiku to illuminate that.
Yeah,
but it's a very flexible approach, but there's definitely not a blank page where you start prose writing. I think that's a very difficult way to go about it.
Yeah.
And less likely to succeed. It is sense that the haiku is not the first thing on the page. When the haiku is the first thing on the page, which is how haiku developed and why it developed simultaneously with Haibun. They both developed by the same writers at the same time.
Yeah, no,
I think there's a vision, because in the West we came across haiku before Haibun. I think that's the way people think it evolved in history. But if you check the history, you see they both evolved together by the same writers, by Basho and his colleagues. They were doing Haibun and haiku at the same time.
Yeah.
Which is why Basho is not just the great haiku writer or haiku writer. He's also the great Haibun writer.
Yeah.
Because he didn't single-handedly invent these forms. He worked with quite a lot of people to develop it, and it was new and untested. But it withstood the test of time. But it had the advantage that it wasn't completely new, because they had the haiku for a very long period of time, long before they decided to separate it out. They had the tradition of haiku writing for an incredibly long time, and they did not change the way the haiku was written. They just simply took it away from the renga, and then they started to write the prose around it, and both sides of it sometimes which is in Japanese is jikai and jiku. Jiku is the verses first, and then the prose is afterwards, something you rarely see in English. Why do we put the haiku at the end? Why not put it first?
Yeah.
It's a jiku, and jikai is where you have the prose followed by the haiku. And then the other thing is this business of what I call one and one. It's fine to write prose and follow it with a haiku, but it's such a limited thing in the sense there's so many other possibilities. And that gradually we're reducing the form into one type of way of writing, which is prose. And I like that form. I think it's great, but it's only one way.
Right.
And we kill our creativity when we over limit. So this is the irony of Haibun form as it's emerging in the West is, ironically, we have a lot of people saying form isn't important, but then at the same time that they're making all these rules that seem to have come out of thin air, and at the same time they're narrowing the definition of the Haibun. So we have this contradictory field where haiku has been expanded into everything that's short, including concrete poems, which it's not. They're called tanshi in Japanese. So we've expanded the haiku into anything goes as long as it's short and as long as somebody will publish it, which it's lost its bearings. Yes. And then the opposite is happening with Haibun. it started as a very broad series of possibilities, and it's gradually being narrowed down into a very confined one. So I find that an amusing paradox. It's like the same bunch of people are going in two opposite directions with the work at the same time. And that's all very well. It's because we have to bear something very important in mind. Haiku writing in English, even in America, for example, is extremely young.
Yeah.
It's not even 100 years old.
True.
I live in my house is older than that. You know, I mean, I live in an area where 100 years is nothing, and it really is nothing. And we have to keep in mind that for a form to really develop, it has to be widely accepted by the mainstream, number one, and for a prolonged period of time.
Yeah,
not for a short period of time.
The test of time.
Yeah, and I'm very conscious that as Haibun writers in English, I'm only writing Haibun for about 30 years. I mean, that's nothing. That's really small. That's just beginners. You're only on the starting blocks after 30 years. And the thing is, you're only in the starting blocks as a novelist after 30 years as well.
Yeah, that's true.
And you're only in the starting blocks in any art form after 20 or 30 years. There isn't an art form that's easy, and there's no quick fix, and there's no fast way forward. And I know that we all look at these programs where people become millionaire pop stars overnight on, what do they call that thing? I forget the name of it now. Like in Britain, they have one, Britain's Got Talent,
Yeah.
And they've got a bunch of these things around the world.
Right.
And there's this image that they all become superstars, they out of nowhere. And what were you doing yesterday? I work in the kitchen in McDonald's, and now I'm going to be a star. But in the real world, it just doesn't happen like that. It takes decades to become a star.
Yeah.
It takes a long time. And so we're still in the infancy. So I'm very conscious of that. And I myself feel that I'm still getting to know this. I'm only beginning to get to know this form and its capabilities. And I have a long way to go before I get a handle on it, really. I'm just in the starting phase of beginning to get some sense of how it works. I definitely feel like that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this, because for us who are real beginners, who don't have 20 years behind us in this art form, this means a lot because there's so little guidance, in elsewhere in literature. So thank you for coming and taking us through your journey of sorts, through this land of memory, its presence of memory and loss of memory, land of dementia. And contrary to what I had expected when I first received the book, the poems are not dark. There are such tender moments. It's so touching, so gentle, so beautiful. So thank you for spending time with us at Drifting Sand, Sean. Hope we can do this again sometime. But before we go, I have a question to ask you. Mm-hmm. What next? What's on Sean's list? Yes.
I've literally just published another book of mainly Haibun, and it's called The God of Bones.
Yeah.
And maybe I should end on, there's actually one piece in it that has a crossover to my father, and it's like an extension of Fragmentation.
Yes.
Of Fragmentation. Fragmentation was published before my father died. And as an aside, he read it and understood it. And he liked it very much.
Oh my God.
And he died about 3 months after Fragmentation was published.
Did he understand?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he was still able to understand. I mean, he got a few things mixed up, but he got the tone of it. In fact, what he said was very interesting. He said, "I'm really glad you wrote this, because now I understand why I'm here."
Oh my God.
I was very struck by that. That was his reaction.
Yes.
Yeah. So since he's parted this world last January 2022, I've had this other book I've been working on for 7 years, which Fragmentation grew out of, and it's become known as The God of Bones. But my father has made an appearance in it through one of the
Okay.
poems since he died.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll finish with that. And
Yes, that would be great.
and
So yeah,
should I
if you
mention
could
where people can get these book, the
please
fragmentation and so on?
please
Yeah.
do, though we will have that in our notes, but
Oh,
please
okay.
do.
Well,
Yes,
it's great if it's
do.
in the notes, but it's seanwriter.com, SEAN writer.com, one word, seanwriter.com. But I would be very pleased if I could end with this piece from The God of Bones, which is
Yes,
called
please do.
Hands. And
Yes, thank you.
as you see, my father reemerges. He crosses over into the God of Bones as well. So thank you so much for having me, Sangita. And thank you, Richard, as well, and everybody on the team in Drifting Sands. I very much appreciate the work they do. So this is called Hands. Dream in a long night, my dead friends and I, dancing in treetops. In the black of night, woken by the calls of my father, he has borrowed the voice of the wind god, yet I recognize him, his reaching cries. He calls me by my forever name, the one I had before mother and father were born. Naked, I move through the window, then the hedge outside, feeling it brush me, soft as lanugo. Over dew-forming grass I walk, following his appeal, until I feel him and know he gestures me to bow down low, crawl into a tangle of briars whose thorns do not cut, but somehow salve and ease me through a tunnel of dense growth above rough earth. I straighten up, my father's wind god voice always before me, the ground dropping downwards, increasing my speed, till I'm running faster and propelled by a gravity beyond the pull of the earth. I feel no more the pound of ground and nothing around me but darkness, air. Black winter moon, unseen waves crashing, the taste of sea spray. Flung out, falling, a sense of heaving water way below. Eyes stream in the salty air and, tumbling forward, the coming into focus of hands reaching up to me, out of the ocean, the hands of everyone I ever met who died. Young Kevin's hands, Mikey's too, old man Grace and the fiddler Donahue, the hands of grandparents, uncles and aunts already gone, cousins, school friends, buddies and lovers, the longed for, the lost. Watanabe Sama, felled by cancer, the girl who dropped from the Seto Bridge, broke the inland sea, and her stillborn child, never named. The hands of dead patients whom I washed in mortuaries, all of them and each of them, reaching up to cushion and comfort, so I may be free from fear to answer the call my father makes on his and their behalf. Into the non-moon, warm on the horizon, our ship of ghosts.
Sean's book, Fragmentation, and his latest book, The God of Bones, are available from his website, seanwriter.com. That is SEANWRITER.com. The music for Ripples in the Sand was by Gran Art. The podcast is edited by Richard Gran. This is Sangita Colorical. Thank you for listening.